Today we want to look at Paul's connection to the Hebrew Scriptures. And Paul had been training and had been trained, at least in some kind of a partial way, as a Pharisee. And that training took place in Jerusalem. And part of the training that Paul received would have been around the place of the Hebrew Scriptures, that is, his Bible. And so we want to not only get a sense of the Bible that Paul used and the connection with it, but also some of the story that that Bible taught. Because without that, we're going to be it's going to be difficult for us to understand Paul's devotion to the text and how Paul approaches his task and how he gets there in the first place. So, um, see if I can make this a little clearer for us. Paul was a skilled interpreter of the text. And so we want to find out what text he was skilled at interpreting. And the text that he was familiar with was the Jewish Bible. And the Jewish Bible, I know it's going to be confusing, but it's known with a number of different designations. And so part of our training is just going to have to be to learn um, what those what the designations are. So the Jewish Bible. It's also called the Old Testament for Christians, the Old Testament. But the Tanakh is the name given to it by Jews, and the consonants in that term, Tanakh, designate the contents. So if you have a Bible nearby, or you can pull one up online and look, you can see, and I'll kind of go through the contents based on the Jewish, um, this Jewish term, Tanakh. So the different consonants um, describe the contents. So the T in Tanakh stands for Torah. That's the law. Typically, the first, well, not typically, it is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That is the law uh, ascribed to Moses, that Moses somehow had a role in its writing, although when you study Jewish scripture, there are all kinds of theories as to when this text takes its final shape. And most of the time, people assert that its final shape probably gets uh, set sometime in the 6th century BC. So, and Moses, of course, is 1500 to 2000 BC, depending on your dates. So, probably not Moses, but typically ascribed to Moses. Um, the Nevi'im, those are the prophets. And if you're looking at your text in English, the table of contents will not directly advertise the prophetic section. Indeed, the Jewish text is organized with a slightly different disposition. But in the English text that you have your table of contents, you're going to see books like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which typically are represented as historical books, but they're included among those books that are among the prophetic. And so, of course, the prophets also include the major prophets: Isaiah, uh, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and then a large 5th grouping. It's kind of, you probably circulated as a text itself, but the minor prophets. And those minor prophets are arranged from largest to smallest, and they begin with Amos, I believe, Hosea or Amos, and then ends up with the small book of Malachi. And that group of prophets, I think there are 12 of them, are compiled in what's called the minor prophets. And then there's a category for the writings, the Ketuvim. You can spell it with a K or you can spell it with a CH. Doesn't really make a difference. And this is a catch-all category for the writings. Again, if you have a table of contents, you can find there are a fair number of books that we haven't looked at yet in terms of where they fall. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. You can also find maybe Ruth in here, although sometimes Ruth is a bridging text. Esther. Some folks don't even include Esther since its earliest version is in Greek, and there is a separate version of Greek located. But the text is located within your Hebrew Bible. It's where the holiday of Purim comes from. So that's the writings. Anything that you don't find in either the Torah or the Nevi'im, you find in the Ketuvim. So this was the Hebrew text. But Paul relies on a translation of the Hebrew text that was called the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew text, and its abbreviation is LXX. And I'm going to give you a quick primer on how it gets that designation. And then the Hebrew text is abbreviated MT, so that stands for Masoretic text. The Masorah were those who put the little dots underneath and annotated the copies so that it could be read in synagogues. It's pretty good bet that Paul could probably read both Hebrew and Greek. Greek for sure, Hebrew almost I'm positive he could read and understand Hebrew and Aramaic, as his training probably prepared him. So Paul quotes regularly from the Greek translation of the Hebrew text. He quotes it. He also alludes to it. That is, it's not a direct quote, but there's enough of the text in the statement to make it apparent that Paul has borrowed or has this certain Old Testament text in mind. For instance, if he was throwing if we were throwing Paul's letters through Turnitin, he would get flagged for some pretty noisy plagiarism, quotation without citation, for his use of the Old Testament. So I want to talk about that translation of the Hebrew text into the Greek. And the first piece that we have to kind of put together here is that this translation, you never have a translation for just because it sounds like a good idea. Translations come because they're needed. And what occasions a translation from Hebrew to Greek? It is, of course, if you know Islam at all, you know there's only one language that you're permitted to read the Quran in, and that's Arabic. Of course, the Quran is translated, and you can read it in English. But the point that I make by alluding to the Quran is that for holy texts, for sacred texts, the language that you read the text in becomes important. If you know something of very, very conservative, nearly fundamentalistic evangelical faith, you know that they love to quote and read from the King James Version. And so if you read from another version, from another translation, everyone gets upset with you. And they say something like, well, if the King James Version was good enough for Jesus, then it's good enough for me. Which is very funny because, of course, Jesus spoke Aramaic, probably could read a little bit of Greek, and Paul obviously knows his Aramaic, knows his Greek, and his Hebrew. Of the King James, however, Paul is thoroughly unacquainted. So how do you get a Greek translation of the Hebrew? You need a miracle. You need something to happen. Now, the reason why you have to have a Greek translation is because of the two exiles. In 721 and 722 BC, somewhere in that date range, the northern kingdom of Israel falls to the Assyrians. At this time in the history of Israel, there are two kingdoms. One is Israel and the other is Judah. The capital of Judah is Jerusalem. The capital in Israel is a place called Shechem. At least that's the holy city. The official capital tended to shift depending on where the leader was from. The northern kingdom falls in 721 or 722 and to the Assyrians, and they're exiled. And the Assyrians begin to besiege Jerusalem at that same time. However, right before they're able to squash Jerusalem, the Assyrians themselves are involved in a coup that ends up being successful. And that coup sends the army that's besieging Jerusalem against itself, depending, of course, upon which of the rivals that they choose. The armies fight right there outside of the city gate of Jerusalem, and then the different factions race home in order to defend their own causes. And miraculously, Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah is spared. This story is recounted in Isaiah chapters 36 through 39. The king, of course, is Hezekiah. The prophet at the time is Isaiah. And so we know a fair amount of the story. And it's a great story. Well, in 721, 720, as Assyria retreats, Babylon is on the rise. And in 586 BCE, Babylon comes trying to annex this part of Judean territory as a buffer between them and Egypt, which of course Egypt was already in full spiraling. It wasn't the kingdom that it once had been. It was not the empire that it once had been. And Babylon had hoped to reclaim that title as an empire. Babylon, you would say, is probably somewhere in Iran, Iraq. If you're near Baghdad, that's one possible location that people think was the seat of Babylonian power. If you're reading your texts, the Old Testament texts, your Jewish texts, sometimes the translation is Chaldees or Chaldeans. In any event, the Babylonians come to town and they besiege and take Jerusalem in 586. And our prophet here is Jeremiah, who records not only the besiegement, but he also records the fall of Jerusalem and his own arrest and deportation to Egypt. In this fall, in this exile, the Jews, as they're called since they're from Judea and Jerusalem, the Jews are exiled both back to Babylon, that's where you get a text like Daniel, and then also to Alexandria, Egypt, that emerges as a really important site for Jewish teaching and the population at large. So what ends up happening, you see, is that the exile produces generations that fall further and further behind in their Hebrew. So invariably, when I teach or when I talk to students, I'll say, "Is English your first language?" And some of them will say yes. And I say, "What about your parents?" And then they'll say no. And so, the other language, whether it's a language where they come in, and then after another generation, the student reflects that they are unable to speak the language of their parents. Sometimes they can understand it. And by the third generation, the language has become a distant memory. You see, that is what gives rise to the necessity of a Greek translation, because in the diaspora, these Jews began to lose track of their Hebrew. And so a fresh translation, a new translation, had to be nearly a miracle. And that's what we're going to find out in our next block.